Sir, your life's in danger.
You have to save my life.
The clinical LED lights cast sterile, blue shadows across the VIP wing as Nicholas Marlene adjusted the tray of surgical instruments, her movements precise and practiced, a mask of professionalism hiding the storm brewing in her mind. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a steady pulse, representing everything the hospital was supposed to protect: life, recovery, and safety. But the man in the bed, Hong Tae-moo, held a clipboard in his trembling hands, his pale face wrapped in blood-seeping bandages that told a story of a war he thought he'd survived. Nicholas checked the door, her dark eyes catching the reflection of a man in a black suit standing sentinel in the hallway, a guardian who looked more like a jailer. To the world, Hong Tae-moo was an untouchable titan of the Seoul underworld, a man with a sharp jawline and eyes that usually commanded empires. Now, he was just a patient, vulnerable and unaware. And she leaned in. The world tilted as she pressed her lips close to his ear, her hand resting on his shoulder with a weight that was both comfort and warning. "Don't touch the four," she whispered, her voice a low vibration that barely disturbed the air. "Your blood is turning to lead." As she slid the lab results onto his lap, she watched the realization dawn on him. The document, circled in jagged red ink, didn't show a recovery. It showed a chemical signature for a toxin that only one man, his most trusted partner, could have accessed. The sterile, pressurized air of the Seoul International Hospital's VIP wing usually hummed with a quiet, expensive efficiency, but tonight it felt like the breath of a beast held in check. The double doors hissed open, and the silence was shattered by the rapid, synchronized footsteps of security detail that moved more like a military unit than a protective escort. At the center of the storm was Hong Tae-moo. He was a man whose name was usually whispered in the high-rise boardrooms and low-lit gambling dens of the city. But as he was wheeled past the nursing station, he looked startlingly human. His skin was the color of parched parchment, his sharp jawline tight with suppressed agony. A thick white bandage was already wrapped around his head, though a fresh, dark crimson was already beginning to bloom through the gauze like a morbid flower. His white dress shirt was ruined, stained with the rust-colored spray of a gunshot wound to the shoulder that the paramedics had barely managed to stabilize. Nicholas Marlene stood at the station, her hands steady as she gripped the edge of a fresh medical chart. She felt the heavy, predatory gaze of the man in the black suit, Tae-moo's lead associate, as he scanned the floor, looking for a weakness, a leak, or a threat. When his eyes landed on her, they lingered. She was an anomaly in this gleaming fortress of glass. A black nurse from Kampala whose presence in Seoul was defined by her clinical excellence and her absolute lack of ties to the intricate, blood-soaked web of local politics. To the Mafia, she was the only variable that couldn't be bought by a rival or manipulated by a grudge. She was a ghost in their machine, and for that reason alone, she was the only one allowed near the king. Nurse Marlene, the administrator's voice was thin, strained by the weight of the patient's identity. "You've been assigned to room 701. Exclusive care. Noto Dashin. You report only to me and the primary security lead." Nicholas nodded, her expression a mask of professional neutrality. She followed the gurney into the room, the scent of ozone and expensive cologne trailing in Tae-moo's wake. As they transferred him to the bed, his eyes fluttered open, dark, intense, and wide with a shock that transcended physical pain. He looked at the sterile monitors and then at Nicholas, his breath hitching in his chest. She moved into his personal space with a practiced, rhythmic grace, her hand resting gently on his uninjured shoulder to ground him. Behind her, the suited associate stood in the doorway, a silent, looming sentinel watching her every move. Nicholas didn't flinch. She picked up the clipboard, her dark eyes locking onto the pale, sweating man in the bed. She wasn't just checking his vitals. She was reading the rhythm of a man who had survived a traumatic incident only to be delivered into a different kind of cage. The war outside was over for the night, but as she looked at the monitors, she realized the real danger had just been wheeled into the room. The rhythmic, artificial sigh of the ventilator in the neighboring room provided a haunting metronome for Nicholas as she stood in the dim light of the nurse's station. It was 3 a.m., the hour when the hospital felt less like a place of healing and more like a waiting room for the afterlife. Hong Temu was finally asleep, his chest rising and falling with a labored, shallow rhythm that nagged at the back of Nicholas's mind. She pulled up the digital laboratory portal, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her dark, focused eyes. On the surface, everything looked according to protocol. The post-operative panels were within the expected ranges for a man who had lost a significant amount of blood. But Nicholas didn't look at the averages. She looked at the trends. Her finger traced the line of his potassium and creatinine levels over the last 6 hours. They were climbing, not in the erratic spikes of a failing kidney, but in a slow, calculated ascent that defied medical logic. She pulled up the toxicology screen, a test that had been marked as routine by the day shift. Most nurses would have glanced at the negative results for common narcotics and moved on. Nicholas, however, noticed the red circle the system had automatically placed around a minor chemical variance, a trace amount of a compound that shouldn't have been there at all. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic pulse that mirrored the danger she had just uncovered. This wasn't a complication of surgery. It was a signature. The compound was a rare, synthetic neurotoxin, one that mimicked the symptoms of a post-traumatic stroke. It was being introduced systematically through his foredrip, timed perfectly to ensure that by the next morning's rounds, the king of the soul underworld would simply never wake up. A chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning settled in her bones. She glanced toward room 701, where the suited sentinel remained stationed, his shadow stretched long and menacing across the linoleum. He wasn't there to protect Temu from the Kim syndicate. He was there to ensure the routine treatment reached its conclusion. The realization shattered the clinical silence of her mind. Every bag of saline, every vital injection she was supposed to administer, was a slow-motion execution. Nicholas closed the laptop, her hand steady but her mind racing. For 90 days, she had watched the world from the shadows, but now the shadows had followed her into the light. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was the only witness to a murder that hadn't finished happening yet. She looked at the red circle on the screen one last time, a blood-colored zero that represented exactly how much time Hong Tae-moo had left if she stayed in her lane. The chill in Nicholas's veins didn't dissipate as she moved back toward room 701. It crystallized into a sharp, defensive edge. She moved with the quiet, ghost-like gait she had perfected in the narrow corridors of her past, her blue scrubs rustling like a soft warning against the polished linoleum. As she approached the heavy oak door of the VIP suite, she slowed her pace, her eyes narrowing as they caught the reflection of the hallway in the glass of a fire extinguisher cabinet. The man in the black suit, the one the staff called an associate, but whose eyes held the cold vacancy of a slaughterhouse floor, was still there. He wasn't pacing or resting against the wall like a tired guard. He stood with a rigid, unnatural stillness that suggested a different kind of duty. Nicholas watched his reflection as he slowly lifted his wrist, his gaze fixed not on the door he was supposed to be guarding, but on the glowing face of a high-end digital stopwatch. She felt a jolt of nausea. He wasn't guarding Tae-moo. He was timing him. He was monitoring the deterioration, as if it were a controlled experiment, a morbid countdown to the moment the toxin finally eclipsed the man's heart. Every time the heart monitor inside the room let out a slightly more labored beep, the man's thumb would hover over the button, his expression one of clinical anticipation rather than alarm. Nicholas adjusted the clipboard in her arms, the physical weight of the lab results feeling like a live grenade. She realized then that the wall of security surrounding Temu was never meant to keep enemies out. It was meant to keep the victim in, ensuring no one interfered with the slow, chemical erosion of his life. The suited figure in the hallway was the primary observer of a silent execution, a man waiting for a specific minute and second to announce a tragic passing. As she reached the door, the man lowered his arm, his sleeve sliding back over the watch with a metallic click that sounded like a coffin lid closing. He turned his head toward her, his eyebrows raising in a mock gesture of concern that didn't reach his wide, predatory eyes. He leaned slightly forward, his mouth opening as if to ask for an update, his posture radiating an urgency that Nicholas now knew was fake. She didn't blink. She met his gaze with the same unwavering, intense focus she had used to survive the shadows of Kampala. To him, she was just an unconnected nurse, a disposable piece of the hospital machinery. He didn't know that she had already seen the red circle on the lab results. He didn't know that the shadow in the hallway was no longer the only one keeping time. Nicholas stepped past him into the room, the scent of his expensive cologne clashing with the antiseptic air, her heart set on a rhythm of her own making. The countdown had begun, but she was the only one who knew the clock could be stopped. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, sealing Nicholas and Hong Temu into a tomb of sterile light and muffled heartbeats. Outside, the shadow of the man with the stopwatch remained cast against the frosted glass. But inside, the air was electric with a new, terrifying clarity. Temu sat upright, his breath hitching as he gripped the clipboard Nicholas had placed in his lap. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, scanned the laboratory results, the jagged red circle around the chemical variants that signaled his end. Nicholas moved with the silent, deliberate grace of a woman who had long lived in the gaps between seconds. She didn't stay at the foot of the bed. She leaned in, her scrubs brushing against the clinical white of his sheets, her hand resting firmly on his trembling shoulder. The proximity was a breach of every hospital protocol, but in this world of monsters and medicine, it was the only way to ensure the walls didn't hear her. "The 4 is the delivery system," she whispered, her voice a low, steady blade that cut through his rising panic. "It's a slow-acting neurotoxin. To anyone else, your death will look like a post-surgical stroke. Unavoidable, tragic, and natural." Temu looked from the paper to the door, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out like cords. The shock in his expression began to calcify into a cold, lethal rage. He looked at the shadow in the hallway, the man he had trusted to guard his life for a decade, and realized the sentinel was actually a vulture waiting for the carcass to cool. The men he had called brothers were merely spectators to his execution. "Why tell me?" Temu's voice was a raspy ghost of its former power, his dark eyes searching hers for a motive. "You're an outsider. You could have walked away and let the clock run out." Nicholas didn't flinch. "I've spent too much of my life watching people pay debts they didn't owe in blood. I didn't come to Seoul to be an accomplice to a ghost." She leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear, her gold earrings catching the clinical light. "They think you're already dead, Mr. Hong. They've already started the countdown, but they didn't account for me. I'm the only variable they didn't calculate." Temu reached out, his fingers, pale and stained with the ghosts of his own blood, clutching her forearm with a desperate, crushing strength. It wasn't the grip of a patient. It was the pact of a king. In that pressurized moment of truth, the nurse and the Mafia boss were no longer strangers. They were two broken individuals standing at the edge of an abyss, recognizing the same fire in each other's eyes. "Save me," he breathed, the command vibrating with a raw, newfound vulnerability. "And I will give you a seat at a table where no one will ever look past you again." Nicholas nodded, her gaze intense and unwavering. The pact was sealed in the silence of the midnight hour. The traders were outside with their stopwatches, but inside, the shadow had finally claimed the king. The clinical silence of the VIP wing was shattered not by a scream, but by the shrill, discordant shriek of the bedside monitor. The green line, representing Hong Timu's heart rate, suddenly fractured into a chaotic, jagged mountain range of ventricular tachycardia. The code blew, alarm erupted, a digital siren that wailed through the corridors, signaling to the hospital that the king was finally falling. Nicholas didn't hesitate. She knew this wasn't a natural arrest. It was the emergency the man with the stopwatch had been waiting for. The toxin had reached the critical concentration required to trigger a fatal arrhythmia. As the heavy doors burst open and a team of loyal medical staff, handpicked by the syndicate, rushed in with a crash cart, Nicholas saw the suited associate in the doorway. He wasn't moving to help. He was leaning against the frame, his thumb clicking the final stop on his watch. "Get back, nurse!" a doctor shouted, reaching for the defibrillator paddles. Nicholas saw the way his hand shook, not with fear, but with the calculated intent to fail the resuscitation. If they shocked him now, with the toxin at its peak, they would only cook his heart muscle, ensuring he never left the table. No. Nicholas's voice was a whip crack that stopped the room. She didn't back away. Instead, she threw her body over Taimu's chest, her dark eyes flashing with a ferocity that stunned the conspirators. "His potassium is spiked. If you shock him now, you'll kill him instantly." Before they could pull her off, Nicholas reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a stolen vial of calcium gluconate, the only thing that could stabilize the cardiac membrane against the poison. With a precision that was more surgical than nursing, she bypassed the fore-pump, which was still trickling death into his veins, and injected the counteragent directly into his central line. The room held its breath. The monitor screamed for another 3 agonizing seconds before the chaotic rhythm suddenly smoothed, the jagged peaks collapsing back into a steady, rhythmic thud. The code was over. Taimu's eyes flew open, locking onto Nicholas with a raw, burning intensity. He was gasping, his chest heaving, but he was alive. The doctors stood frozen, their accidental execution thwarted by a woman they had deemed invisible. Nicholas stood up, smoothing her blue scrubs, her gaze turning to the man in the doorway. The suited associate's face had drained of color, his stopwatch forgotten in his hand. The emergency had been triggered, but Nicholas had performed a surgical intervention on the conspiracy itself. The king had survived the code, and now the hunters were the ones who needed to run. The aftermath of the failed code left the VIP wing in a state of brittle, artificial calm. While the medical team retreated to the shadows of the nurse's station to whisper about the miraculous recovery, Nicholas moved through the room with the clinical focus of a sapper defusing a bomb. The suited associate still stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked skyline of Seoul, but his reflection in the glass was focused entirely on Nicholas. He was waiting for the next tremor, the final collapse that his stopwatch promised was inevitable. He didn't see the sleight of hand. Nicholas stood by the fore-pole, her body positioned to shield the man in the bed from the camera's unblinking eye and the guard's peripheral vision. With a movement so fluid it appeared routine, she clamped the line leading to the secondary bag, the one laced with the neurotoxin. From the pocket of her scrubs, she withdrew a fresh, identical bag filled with simple, harmless saline. As she swapped the bags, her fingers brushed against Taimu's arm. He remained still, his eyes closed in a feigned unconsciousness, but she felt the tightening of his muscles, a silent acknowledgement of the liquid armor she was now flowing into his veins. She wasn't just hydrating him. She was creating a sanctuary. By replacing the poison with a placebo, she was buying them the most valuable currency in the underworld, the illusion of success. She then took the half-empty bag of toxin and, instead of disposing of it where it could be found, She carefully drained a portion into a sterile specimen cup tucked into her palm. This was her evidence, her red circle made physical. To the traitors, Temu would continue to look like a man drifting toward a peaceful end. His heart rate would remain low, his color pale, and his responsiveness dulled, not by the drug, but by a sheer performance. Nicholas adjusted the drip rate, the steady thump-thump of the saline hitting the chamber sounding like a drumbeat for the war to come. She stepped back, smoothing the sheets with a cold, professional mask. The associate turned from the window, his eyes scanning the equipment, but he saw only what he expected to see. A patient being sustained by a nurse who didn't know she was presiding over a funeral. His vitals are stable for now, Nicholas said, her voice devoid of emotion as she passed the guard. But the damage to the cardiac wall is extensive. It's only a matter of time. The man in the suit nodded, a thin, predatory smile touching his lips. He believed the plan was moving forward, unaware that the shadow had already rewired the machinery of his betrayal. Inside the bag, the clear liquid sparkled under the LED lights, a transparent shield that would keep the king alive long enough to burn the empire down. The hospital at 4 a.m. was a labyrinth of shadows and hummed with the deceptive peace of a graveyard. Nicholas moved with a predatory silence, her blue scrubs blending into the dim, recessed lighting of the restricted basement level. She had precisely 11 minutes before the security rotation shifted and the retinal scanners on the pathology wing reset. In her hand, she clutched the specimen cup containing the liquid death she had siphoned from Temu's four, the plastic warm against her palm like a captured secret. The high-security lab was a fortress of glass and steel, guarded by a heavy biometric door. Nicholas didn't use her own badge. She used a clone card she had swiped from the administrator's desk during the chaos of the code blue. The lock clicked with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the hollow corridor. She slipped inside, the air instantly turning colder, smelling of ozone and deep refrigeration. She navigated the darkened lab by the glow of the equipment's standby lights. Her target was the mass spectrometer. She needed to know the exact molecular origin of the toxin, not just what it was, but where it had been manufactured. Every pharmaceutical batch carried a digital fingerprint, a trail that led back to the hand that held the needle. She loaded the sample. The machine let out a low, mechanical whir that sounded to her ears like a scream. "Come on," she whispered, her gaze darting to the security monitor near the ceiling. The red light of the camera was unblinking, a digital eye watching her every move. The screen on the spectrometer began to flicker with data, mapping the chemical structure of the poison. Suddenly, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed from a hallway. A flashlight beam cut through the frosted glass of the lab door, sweeping across the benches. Nicholas dropped to the floor, her heart slamming against her ribs. She crawled beneath a heavy steel workstation, her breath shallow and controlled as the door handle turned. "Who's in there?" a voice demanded. It was the suited associate. He hadn't stayed by the window. He was hunting. The beam of the flashlight danced over the very machine Nicholas was using, the monitor still glowing with the results of the analysis. Just as the light was about to settle on the specimen cup she had left on the counter, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the hallway. The distraction she had rigged by overbalancing a tray of metal instruments. The associate swore and retreated, his footsteps receding toward the noise. Nicholas didn't waste a second. She lunged for the screen, her eyes widening as she read the final line of the report. The manufacturer wasn't a rival syndicate. It was H Biotech, a subsidiary company whose majority shares were held by the man currently standing guard at Temu's door. The lab rat had found the poison's nest. She grabbed the printout and the sample, vanishing into the service stairwell just as the security alarm began its slow, rhythmic wail. The VIP suite was cast in a sickly, pre-dawn gloom, the only light coming from the rhythmic, green pulse of the cardiac monitor. It was 4:45 a.m., the dead zone of the hospital shift, the hour when the soul is said to be at its weakest. Outside, the rain had slowed to a persistent, mournful drizzle against the reinforced glass. The heavy oak door creaked open, admitting the man in the black suit. He moved with a new sense of entitlement, his stopwatch tucked away, replaced by the heavy, metallic weight of a silenced handgun concealed beneath his jacket. He didn't look like a guard anymore. He looked like an heir. He approached the bed where the silhouette of Hong Tae-moo lay motionless, the white sheets pulled high against his chest. The associate's eyes were fixed on the four-bag, the one Nicholas had swapped, believing it still held the final, paralyzing dose of H-biotech neurotoxin. He reached out, his gloved hand closing around the plastic tubing, intent on flushing the line to accelerate the natural heart failure. "You're late," a voice rasped from the darkness. The associate froze, his heart skipping a beat as the bed adjusted with a mechanical whine. The figure under the sheets didn't limp or struggle. Hong Tae-moo sat upright with the predatory grace of a lion that had been feigning sleep. The blood-stained bandages remained wrapped around his head, but his eyes were wide, clear, and burning with a lethal, terrifying lucidity. He wasn't the drifting casualty the associate had been timing for hours. He was the king, restored. Tae-moo held a single piece of thermal paper in his hand, the lab results Nicholas had retrieved from the basement. "I was curious to see if you'd wait for the machine to flatline, or if you'd have the courage to finish it yourself." "Minho," Tae-moo said, his voice a low, vibrating blade. "It turns out you're even more impatient than I remembered." The associate lunged for his weapon, but the movement was useless. From the shadows behind the heavy velvet curtains, Nicholas stepped into the light. She didn't have a gun, but she held a heavy, surgical tray with the steady, unwavering grip of someone who had seen too much blood to be afraid of it anymore. Her gaze locked onto the associate, her dark eyes reflecting the clinical coldness of the room. "The saline you've been monitoring for the last 2 hours was quite refreshing," Tae-moo continued, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He stood up, towering over the man who had tried to time his death. The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently the air seemed to thin. The associate backed toward the door, his hand trembling as he realized the invisible nurse and the dying boss had spent the night rewiring his empire. The hunter had walked into a room he thought was a morgue, only to find the occupant was waiting for an audience. The silence of the VIP wing didn't just break, it detonated. Realizing his stopwatch had run out and his leverage had evaporated, Minho didn't reach for words. He reached for the suppressed pistol in his waistband. But the hospital room, once a site of passive observation, had been transformed into a tactical kill zone by the woman the syndicate had overlooked. Nicholas moved before the associate could level his aim. She didn't strike with the blunt force of a fighter, but with the cold, anatomical precision of a healer who knew exactly how the human machine could be dismantled. As Minho lunged forward, Nicholas swung the heavy stainless steel surgical tray, catching the bridge of his nose with a sickening crunch of bone. The blow didn't just stun him. It blinded him with a rush of involuntary tears and blood. He roared, swinging blindly, but Nicholas was already inside his guard. Her fingers, usually gentle enough to find a collapsing vein, clamped onto his wrist with a rhythmic pressure. She didn't struggle against his strength. She used it. With a sharp, practiced twist, she applied a fulcrum to his radial nerve, a technique used to stabilize violent patients, causing his hand to seize and the pistol to clatter uselessly to the linoleum. "You're a nurse," Minho hissed, his face a mask of gore as he tried to pin her against the heavy medical monitors. "You're supposed to save lives." "I am saving one," Nicholas replied, her voice a low, terrifying vibration. As he surged forward, she grabbed a pre-filled syringe from her pocket. Not the calcium she had used earlier, but a concentrated dose of rocuronium, a rapid-onset paralytic used for intubation. In the chaotic tumble, she found the exposed junction of his neck and shoulder. She didn't stab blindly. She found the brachial plexus. With a single, fluid motion, she depressed the plunger. The effect was instantaneous. The violence drained from Minho's limbs as if a plug had been pulled. His muscles betrayed him, turning from iron to water. He collapsed against the foot of the bed, his eyes wide with a new, silent horror as his vocal cords paralyzed, leaving his scream trapped in a throat that could no longer move. He was fully conscious, fully aware, and completely immobile, a prisoner in his own skin. Nicholas stood over him, her breathing shallow but steady, her blue scrubs splattered with the red ink of his betrayal. She didn't look at the fallen man. She looked at Temu. The king was standing now, his hand resting on the four-pole for balance. His gaze locked onto Nicholas with a reverence that bordered on fear. The struggle was over, written in the blood on the floor and the clinical silence of the paralyzed traitor. She had used the tools of life to deliver a living death, and in that moment, the nurse had finished her transformation into a warrior. The rain outside the Seoul International Hospital finally ceased, leaving the city washed in a cold, neon clarity that matched the shift within the VIP wing. The clinical smell of antiseptic had been replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of a battle concluded. Hong Temu stood by the window, no longer a patient in a blood-stained gown, but a king reclaimed. He wore a tailored black suit that concealed the bandages on his shoulder, his presence once again filling the room with the suffocating weight of absolute authority. Beside him, Nicholas Marlene stood with a quiet, lethal poise. She had traded her blue scrubs for a sleek, dark blazer and the gold hoops that caught the rising sun. Her transformation from a silent healer to a sovereign of strategy complete. The staff who had once looked past her now averted their eyes in a mixture of awe and terror. They no longer saw a nurse. They saw the woman who had reached into the machinery of death and rewired it to her will. The door to the suite opened, and the remaining elders of the Hong Syndicate filed in, their faces pale as they looked from the paralyzed, wide-eyed form of Minho on the floor to the upright, living legend before them. They had come to pay respects to a corpse, only to find a tribunal. "You all relied on the clock," Temu said, his voice a low, predatory vibration that made the air in the room thin. "You calculated my end down to the second, but you failed to account for the shadow that was watching the watchman." He turned his gaze to Nicholas, and for the first time, the coldness in his eyes softened into a look of profound, unwavering recognition. He didn't just owe her his life. He had found in her the only mirror to his own broken, formidable soul. He reached out, his hand resting on her shoulder, not as a patient seeking support, but as a monarch acknowledging his equal. "The hospital is no longer your station, Nicholas," he murmured, loud enough for the trembling elders to hear. "The empire is—" Nicholas didn't flinch. She looked out at the sprawling Seoul skyline, realizing that the invisible life she had led in Kampala and the outsider status she had held in the wards were over. She was no longer a ghost in the machinery of other people's wars. She had become the variable that defined the light. As they walked out of the VIP wing, flanked by a new, vetted security detail, the rhythmic beep of the monitors faded into the distance, replaced by the heavy, synchronized footsteps of power. The dead in Uganda was settled. The poison in Seoul was purged, and the reign had begun. From the bedside to the boardroom, from a needle to the throne, Nicholas Marlene was no longer a nurse. She was the sovereign of Hong Temu's survival, and the only thing that made the invincible king truly whole. The reign of Hong Temu was no longer a solo performance. It was a symphony of survival conducted by the woman who had seen the rot and purged it. As the heavy doors of the hospital closed behind them, The sterile scent of the ward was replaced by the crisp, biting air of a Seoul winter, sharp and full of promise. Nicholas Marlene did not walk behind the king, but beside him, her reflection caught in the polished chrome of the armored motorcade. The elders of the syndicate stood in a silent, bowed line, their stopwatches gone, replaced by the weight of their own uncertainty. They realized that the unconnected nurse had become the most dangerous connection in the city, the bridge between Temu's life and his legacy. Temu stopped at the lead car, his hand resting on the open door. He turned to Nicholas, the neon lights of the city reflecting in his dark, resolute eyes. They will spend the rest of their lives wondering how a ghost from Kampala stole their victory, he murmured, his voice a low, possessive vibration. Nicholas looked back at the hospital, then at the man who had traded his solitary crown for a shared throne. She had arrived in Korea, seeking a way to disappear from her own history. She was leaving the hospital as the woman who would write the future of an empire. Let them wonder, she replied, her voice steady and lethal. By the time they find the answer, we will have redefined the game. She stepped into the car, the door closing with a heavy, final thud that echoed like a period at the end of a long, blood-soaked sentence. The engine roared to life, a predatory purr that signaled the start of a new era. The hunt was over. The poison was gone. In the heart of the city, the shadow and the king moved forward together, a single, invincible force of nature.